Hi, if everyone can take their seats, that'd be great. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Executive Director of the Cambridge Historical Society, and I'd like to thank you all for coming for this great program. Putting together this series of lectures has really been a very interesting and informative process. I've certainly learned a lot. And it's certainly auspicious to have this program on April 19th, on Patriots' Day, which commemorates Barbara Ackerman's ride as the modern-day Paul Revere. Which, for the record, was not actually on April 19th. But I would like to point out that Barbara Ackerman is in the audience in the front row, so everyone can say hello. So I'll try not to take too much of your time. I just want to let you know that the Cambridge Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We are membership supported. We are not funded by taxpayers' money or a part of any larger institution like a university. And we depend on membership support to be able to continue to produce programs like this and to put all of this together. So you'll notice in your program that there's a membership form. I hope some of you will consider joining. If you're not interested in joining, we will also accept donations. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our host. Our host for this evening is Karilyn Crockett. She is completing her PhD at Yale University in the American Studies program and is completing her dissertation on the history of the Inner Belt. Before she begins, we're going to have a brief message from Steve Miller about Livable Streets Alliance.
Hi, on behalf of Livable Streets Alliance, who's co-sponsoring the series, we also want to welcome you. Livable Streets Alliance is in fact sort of an inheritor of the tradition started by a group that worked very strongly on the Inner Belt fight called Urban Planning Aid. I was actually an employee of Urban Planning Aid working under several people in the audience. So for all of us, this is an experience of learning a lot, hopefully incorporating these lessons in the work all of our organizations, and I know Livable Streets Alliance will be doing. But for a lot of us, this is a reunion. This is a party. I've been hugging more people than I thought appropriate in public. So welcome to all of you. I hope we are inspired by what we hear today and through this whole series, and we carry forward because the fight continues. Take care.
Okay, just wanted to mention that the Historical Society is proud to be co-sponsored in these programs by Livable Streets Alliance, MIT, and the Lincoln Institutes. And none of this would have been possible without the underwriting support of the Irving House and the additional support of Forest City. We're very grateful to all of them, and we're also grateful to a great committee that put this whole program together that included Alyssa Pacey, Jim Peters, Steve Miller, Michael Kenny, myself, and many others. So thank you. And without further ado, here's Karilyn Crockett.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. You look great. We have a fantastic program planned for you. Again, my name is Karilyn Crockett. I have so much excitement for tonight. I can barely contain it, but I will try. So thank you all for joining us for the second panel of what is a three-part series that the Cambridge Historical Society is hosting for all of us. I see that, in fact, there are several members in the audience from our first panel. I see Tani Lee out there. I see Fred Savucci. Yeah, I see, let's see, who do I see? Bob out there, Bob Goodman is out there. Yeah, so you know the series is great because folks are coming back again and again for more and more. And so hopefully many of you will come for the third panel, and we will look forward to it. So tonight, we discuss the organizers. It was not the case that someone came in and swooped on a horse, aside from Mayor Ackerman, of course. Someone did not swoop down and save Boston and save Somerville and save Cambridge. Residents stood up and said no, and said we want something better, and went about putting it in place. And so that is what we're here to talk about tonight. The residents, the organizers, the folks who really took to the streets and made this history what it is. But I had nothing to do with this. I was not there. I was not even born. In fact, I don't live in Cambridge, I live in Boston. So I am a beneficiary of all of the organizing and all of the work and the mobilizing that happened in our region. I am a graduate student, also could be considered a super fan of the inner belt history, a super cheerleader and groupie of what I feel like is a phenomenal story, a seminal story of our time and certainly of our region. When we think about urban transformation in the 20th century, we know what didn't happen. We know a lot of the fights that were lost. We know how important the liberation movements were, civil rights, black liberation, women's movement. What we see in the fight for the inner belt is an incredible convergence of several different movements coming together and offering us the very best of citizen participation, of civic mobilization, and of people just saying no. So I have the distinct honor of hosting this evening and introducing our panelists to you. So without further ado, I will begin with our first panelist who's here. Ansti Benfield will speak with us. We will also have Fellman, who is here, and Hershfang, and Bobby Norfleet. As Steve mentioned, this is a bit of a reunion tonight. So they're going to share some stories, they're going to show us some slides, they're going to talk to us, and we're going to save some time so that hopefully we can have some Q&A and just talk a little bit. And hopefully by the time this is all over, you won't want to leave. You want to hang around and keep talking some more. And I know there are many people in this room that I also am looking forward to. Delighted to be here. Again, for me personally, it's like getting to meet folks that you've only read about and really seeing them and hearing. So it's really fantastic to be here. So, Ansti, where are you back here? Ansti Benfield was one of the founding members of the opposition to the Inner Belt. She recruited friends and neighbors and participated in countless meetings discussing tactics from letter writing campaigns. This is all true, right? Letter writing campaigns to direct action. She was a member of Save Our Cities. You guys know this is one of the seminal resident organizing groups that really sparked what would become the Boston Anti-Highway movement. Her group's leading citizen opposition to the highway. She completed a master's in urban studies from Boston University in 1968, and her thesis was titled Inner Belt. So, Ansti, welcome.
There are a few familiar faces out there. Hi, everybody. And thank you so much, Karilyn and Gavin and the whole team. And the whole idea of the mural is that a team of people getting together and working together can stop anything. And look who we stopped. Governor Volpe and all his construction equipment. You realize that Governor Volpe had the contracts to build the Inner Belt. And so when he got taken off to Washington, D.C. as the Secretary of Transportation in 1969, wouldn't you know, he was just going to go down and sign all his own favorite plans. And we said, no, you don't. Stop. Okay, I hit the space bar, is that correct? Go. I want to thank Barbara Ackerman so much for being here and for letting me use her book. This is her book. If you haven't read it, hopefully the library has a few copies. We'll find out. There she is. She wrote it in 1989. Okay, here is the Brookline Elm Street route from the river, from the BU Bridge, 1,500 houses, dwelling units. We were on Chestnut Street, the third house, the third row up. And you know who else lived on Chestnut Street now? Mayor Davis lives on Chestnut Street. And she said last week, boy, it's a good thing they didn't build that highway. Our house would be just awful to live in. And our house would have been awful at 140 Chestnut Street. We got more to tell you about 140 Chestnut Street. Okay, it started in 1965. You have a timeline, by the way, that my granddaughter Abigail, 11 years old, front row there, created for you on her father's creed. Anyway, check your, from 1948 to 1960, they were planning this. When we bought our house at 140 Chestnut Street in 1963, we were promised no one would touch they wouldn't build that. There was a planned highway, but nobody was going to build it because Cambridge had the veto power. Look at your timeline, 1965, the legislature, Massachusetts legislature reversed that veto, and in April 1965, the plans for the Brookline Elm Street were on the front page, and it took us until maybe the middle of September to pull together enough letters, and that first one by Bill Ackerley said, let's save our city. Now that's part of where the name came from, along with Save Our Sycamores was an earlier version of that, and he gave his telephone number. Did I call him? Of course I called him. He lived on Lopez Street. And then I and my husband, Michael, wrote letters to the Globe and letters to the Herald. And personally, I would like to see the whole built tunnel underground, however, not financially possible. So we were on the road, and Bill Ackerley and I canvassed the entire route from I did the Ryu Bridge to Lopez Street, he did Lopez Street to the Somerville line. We got 1,000 signatures, and there were 300 of us opposed. That's Granite Street, by the way. And I'm standing in a white coat with Kristen, my daughter, in tow. And we walked all the way up the Brookline up the Brookline Street to down Mass Ave to City Hall, and what did we do? We nailed Martin Luther, 1517, not 95 treatise. No, we nailed 1,000 signatures. You'll notice it's backwards. I'm not left-handed. The Globe print came out inside out. Anyway, we nailed it up on wood doors at City Hall. Same door. I didn't notice, Barbara, were the doors wood when you rode your horse? Or had they been shifted to glass? Now, now they're glass. So we nailed the petition, and we had meetings, 450. By that time, the city, in 1966, the city started printing these signs. You see these signs? They did about 500 of them. We plastered them all the way up and down, every house up and down. And then we had a little problem with MIT, because MIT, their senior administrators wanted to build it. We're pushing very hard, and they had some of the city councilors in their pocket. And so we went and picketed. That I'm standing there in high heels and a suit. Everybody said, "That's you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me." And Kristen sitting at the bottom. Okay, then we pulled together a State House, and Volpe would not even come out and greet us. He had no intentions of having anything to do with us. So what did we do? We went to Washington. Okay, 2 busloads, loaded at 10 p.m. in front of City Hall, to drive all the way to Washington, D.C., to see Tip O'Neill, Ted Kennedy, Ed Brooke, and to picket the new Department of Transportation led by Bridwell at that point, later by Volpe. Anyway, on the way down, these signs were at the back of the bus, sitting on the back seat. And Kristen was in kindergarten. She was 5 years old. And she read the sign. Oh, I can read that. Cambridge is a city, not a highway. She started to chant. Before we got through, the whole bus was singing, Cambridge is a city, not a highway. Please don't build roads through our homes. We want to stop the highway and beat the belt, beat the belt, beat the belt in Washington. Well, guess what? The 5 of them, they called it the Lollipop Lobby, and this turned up on the front page of the Washington Post the next day, and they sang it, the 5 little kids. There were 78 of us in all, but there were 5 little kids who stood up in front of Tip O'Neill, and they were short as I am. I could hardly see any of you over the top of the podium. They could barely see Tip O'Neill over the top of the podium, and Ted Kennedy sitting next to him, and Ed Brooks sitting next to him, and they sang this song to him. And I looked, and there is a tear trickling down Tip O'Neill's face. So what happens next? Tip O'Neill vows to fight the path of the Interbelt, doesn't he? He sure does. 78 bus-weary travelers from Cambridge, Wednesday morning, assured that they would fight the Interbelt as long as it takes to beat it. But thanks to those 5 little kids, I'll tell you. Now, the reason Henrietta Jackson is sitting here, and I stole her from Six Speak, I hope you don't mind, was that she was one of the first people to sign. She lived on Hamilton Street. And I got to know her very well. And when we were picketing in Washington, picketing the Department of Transportation, I was so busy holding signs. And my 3-year-old daughter, Becky, said to Henrietta, "Can I hold your hand while we walk?" And Henrietta told me this story later, and I was so touched. And I bet nobody ever told you people that. Well, at this point, Mayor Dan Hayes decided something had to be done, more than just the residents picketing here and there, and Tip O'Neill was strong enough, but not that strong. So he appointed people like Galbraith and Moynihan, and I don't know how many of you went to the meeting last week, but Fred told an incredible story about Moynihan and Galbraith, and when this all comes out on tape, you can hear the story of Galbraith and Moynihan with mayors. And then what happened? Nixon was elected in November of 1968 as the Republican president. He appointed Volpe his Secretary of Transportation, so that by his inauguration in January of '69, Volpe went to Washington to sign his own plans for the Interbelt, and our only resource was to get Frank Sargent, who had just been inaugurated. So the city asked me, this was the last thing I did as a community organizer, and the city asked me to help pull together everything that was going to happen. Well, and meanwhile, we had all kinds of other help. I mean, I haven't even mentioned the technical help we had from MIT with Gordon Fellman and Bob Goodman and Fred Savlucci and Tony Lee and everybody like that. But not to even begin to mention all the priests and ministers, Father McManus from St. Mary's and Father McDevitt from the Blessed Sacrament. So anyway, I have got to read you what Barbara says about her. Do you mind, Barbara? Okay. Paul Revere ride was another part of public relations. It took place on a thin, chilly, rainy day, Friday. I hoped my rented tricorn hat would not melt. My horse was waiting for me in Hastings Park. That's on the corner of on Brookline Street, right next to where Steve Miller lives, okay? Anyway, my horse was waiting in Hastings Park on Brookline Street, accompanied by Paul Morris, the mayor's secretary, driving the mayor's car. Horses are surprisingly high and broad when you think of sitting on them, and this was the broadest I had ever had a chance to ride. The attendant boosted me up and handed me the reins as I tried to remember what my riding teacher had taught me. I had not contracted to be in charge of that horse. Paul Morris was back in the car. He let out a wail on the siren. I nearly fell off. But the horse was wonderfully lethargic, probably deaf. When my heart stopped pounding, I had the problem of making it move, so I kicked my heels as gently as I could, not to stir it to a canter. Nothing happened. I kicked a little harder, and then I kicked very hard indeed. The saddle shifted slightly under me, and we moved north. Behind us, Paul drove the car at a snail's pace and switched the box over to the loudspeaker. "The highway is coming," his eerie voice said. He had been given a script. He was not enthusiastic, but he was game. "Citizens of Cambridge, come out and save our city. The highway is coming." Then the mayor's photographer, click, click, click. That was the point of the whole wet affair in front of City Hall. The picture was odd enough to get into the Boston Globe, and readers from Connecticut to Maine. How many do you suppose took long enough to discover the message behind it? So, then what did we do next? Well, we organized all of Cambridge, okay? And I had quite a lot to do with it. In the meantime, the city council was supposed to fly in a helicopter while the rest of us walked. They closed Mass Avenue from City Hall all the way past MIT, over the river, and then it took 4 hours, you realize. Most of us were walking. I was on a bike with 20 balloons. Oh, but the balloons are different situation. And down Commonwealth Avenue through the middle to the State House, okay? And Barbara says, "I wished I'd walked the whole way." But the rest of them ended up in a helicopter they took. People Before Highways a Day was a sunny January day. There were all kinds of signs. One said, at MIT, said, "Compute the belt," or "Cambridge will melt." Another one, a dog or a sign that said, "Bite the belt." None of that is so unusual, said Barbara. What was unusual were the off-duty police marching in uniform in protest with peace and freedom, and other ragtag protesters too. That off-duty DPW workers marched along with the fire chief and 50 off-duty firemen in uniform with fire engines, a hose truck, hook and ladder. You may have seen a fire engine on a 4th of July parade, but have you ever seen the garbage trucks parading covered in balloons? Well, I need to explain that the city subsidized 5,000 balloons and a 6-foot helium tank, which they delivered the week before the parade to our house at 140 Chestnut Street. And my ex-husband started blowing up balloons 2 days before. And I talked to my daughter, Becky, in Seattle last week, and she said, "Mom, those balloons were everywhere." She said they'd all be in the ceiling at night, and I'd come down in the morning, and they'd all be on the floor because helium didn't stay in them. And we had an arrangement with the school children that they would come and take 20 or 30 balloons on their bikes up to the marchers on Mass Avenue. So before I don't know that all 5,000 balloons ended up there. 2 of them ended up with Gavin, or one with Gavin, and I have the other one. But it was a very strange group that went down all the way to the State House, where we met another 1,500 or 2,000 people from other communities, Greater Boston, the Greater Boston Committee to Save Our cities, whatever it was, I can't remember the name. And that is a clip from Divided Highways. Anybody who can get on to PBS Divided Highways, it's a wonderful 2-hour special on the history of all highways from 1880 to 1997. They have a half an hour on Cambridge, and they have, that's me, with a red balloon that says, "Homes Not Highways." And I'm hollering in my red jacket at the top of my lungs to 2,500 people about hey, you know, it's not right to go through the middle. It would go through the middle of all of our homes. And I wasn't strident about it. I wasn't angry. I just begging them to stop the highway. Question? At that point, the new governor, Sargent, spoke right after me. If we have to build highways, we'll build them with a heart. And you really do need to watch the whole divided highways. It does a lot more than a lot. And then he says, if we're going to build highways, we're going to put the people over the cement, not the cement over the people. And I thought that was pretty neat. And he had an incredible ability to stand up to Volpe, pull back. He canceled all the highway plans, put a total moratorium on it, and then that's the last time I had pretty much anything to do with this until 1980 when Bernie Lacasse painted the mural. Now, I think it's time for a little bit of reenactment. I love reenactments, whether it's Paul Revere or Martin Luther or Tip O'Neill. So anybody who wants a balloon at the end, anybody who wants a balloon at the end. And thank you, Andrew and Abby and Kristen and everybody for blowing them up. I'm done.
So one of the things you'll see in your program is this timeline, right? And it reminds us that the anti-highway movement did not happen overnight. So folks were involved in this for the long haul. And once Ansti and organizers take to the street, what is it that makes this thing last and last and last for years? One of the organizations that was seminal to this work was Urban Planning Aid. Gordon Fellman is going to come and talk to us a little bit about his work there. Gordon is a sociology professor at Brandeis University. He studied sociology at Antioch, I didn't know that, and Harvard University, where he received his PhD and taught before coming to Brandeis. As you can see, after completing a dissertation on a political figure in India, curious to know who that might be, Fellman published The Deceived Majority. Some of you hopefully have seen that book. I know it's here in the room. The Deceived Majority, The Politics and Protests in Middle America, which is a study of the inner belt highway fight. So again, one of the founders of Urban Planning Aid, Fellman led UPA's successful project convincing the Boston Redevelopment Authority to accept neighborhood participation in planning in housing that replaced the units taken for the new Madison Park High School in Boston. And you can see a few of Gordon's publications there. I know that sometimes it seems so hard to think that something like citizen participation seems so radical and so unthinkable. Like, how is that hard? But at that time, it was, right? It was revolutionary to think that people in a community should have something to say and have the authority to enact that vision. So, Gordon, thanks for coming and talking to us a little bit about what you guys were up to with UPA.
I'm not very good at high-tech stuff. Some years ago, before DVDs came out, I was fiddling in a class with a VCR, trying to show a movie to a class, and it was taking me a long time, and I didn't quite master it. And I turned to the class apologetically, and I said, at my age, I'm kind of low-tech. One of my students says, "You're not low-tech, you're a techno-peasant." I am. I can't do PowerPoint. I'll just talk. So I started talking to people, and I find this. They, the government highway planners, they say people will go to suburbia, but everyone doesn't want to go to suburbia. I don't. It's a woman from Brookline Street in her late 50s, a man on Brookline Elm. I'm going to stay right where I am if I have to shoot them. I'm going to stay where I am. I mean that. 80-year-old woman, homeowner on Brookline Street. Moving, it does something to you. I can't say. It's like losing a member of the family. Then I go on to an editorial in the Boston Globe. This is July 31st, 1963, urging completion of the Belt Plan. The Globe says, one can sympathize with families or businesses displaced, but progress often extracts a high price. Too often, veiled from public view, much of the trouble springs from powerful political pressures. Wasn't clear which pressures they meant, but I had some idea of what I meant. Then later, in a chapter called Middle American Political Behavior, Alienation and the Meaning of Protest, I quote a young man on Brookline Street who says, the protesters can fight all they want, but they won't win. A 56-year-old man, homeowner on Elm Street, says, if the government makes up their mind the road's going to go through Elm Street, 1 million people wouldn't stop them, regardless of how many letters you write or anything like that. An old woman on Elm Street, we don't know nothing about politics, and we don't want to except for the belt. Here's a few more, and then I'll go on to something else. In a chapter called Political Misperceptions and Realities, I quote a middle-aged woman not active in Save Our Cities. She says, you elect these people, and they're supposed to represent us. So if you have anything you want done, present it to those people. The only way you can do it is through your senator or congressman. Then a middle-aged homeowner active in the protest, the question asked is, what have the local protest leaders done? The answer is, they're appealing to the government in Washington and having private meetings on the inner belt. Our congressman has asked Federal Highway Administrator Whitten, Hubert Humphrey, and President Johnson to come to Cambridge to see the route. A young housewife occasionally active with Save Our Cities. The question was, what would you do if you were a protest leader? She says, I'd go right to Washington. Where? To whom? I forget the name. I think Senator Bob Kennedy has something to do with it. What would you tell your neighbors to do? I told them to write letters to Washington. Now, part of what I found and part of what was in this for me was this. I thought there were many hearings in the city council, there were hearings all over the place, and I did a field study. I have notes on everything Ansti has talked about, and I really enjoyed working from those notes in the interviews that we did later. But one thing that I realized was that if in a city council meeting or a state assembly meeting of some kind, a person from the neighborhood stood up and said, look, don't take my home. This is my house. You know, I live here. My sister lives down the street. I go to the church a block away. Don't take my home. That would be greeted with a kind of a shrug of the shoulders. I thought, all right, I'll do something fancy. I'm a sociologist, all right? I'll wear a necktie and jacket, nice shirt, and I will have charts, and I will talk in a very calm manner. And I will say, according to the data which I've collected, X, whatever percent of people in this area have lived here for over 20 years. So many have lived here for over 30 years. Then I had data on how many people had relatives living within a 2-block radius, a 4-block radius, or whatever. Then I had data on how many people use local neighborhood facilities like churches, stores, and so on and so forth. So I was trying to define a neighborhood in terms of people's anchoring in it, their connections with it, the networks that they had. And although it really didn't amount to much more than don't take my home, it's my home, it was fancy, all right? It was academic, and it was calm, and I was wearing a necktie and jacket. And I thought, well, that's part of what I can do. I can use my professional skills to translate something into terms that are acceptable to people who are persuaded by that kind of thing. Eric Erickson once in a book said, he said, I'm going to use a chart now, and he says, charts are the kinds of things that are helpful for the kinds of people who are helped by that kind of thing. I felt that way about using all the charts I was using, but it seemed to work. Anyway, what happened was that, in fact, many people felt discouraged and felt hopeless. People did not want to move. I remember I addressed a meeting of highway planners at some point in the late stages of the Belt movement, and one of the highway planners said to me, he says, you know, I don't get it. What's the matter with people moving? People move their neighborhoods all the time. I moved 3 years ago. My family and I moved from, I forget, Delaware to Washington. What's the big deal about moving? I said, look, if you moved from Delaware to Washington, it was probably an upward mobile move, wasn't it? He said, mm-hmm. I said, it probably had to do with your career and something that was important to you. I said, well, when you tell somebody you have to leave your house because a highway is going to come through, that's not the same thing. You get it? That's not the same thing. It really, really isn't the same thing. And he didn't get it, but I tried. Anyway, it was an amazing experience, and part of what was so thrilling was, and no one could foresee this at the beginning, that as I remember it, and the documentary that Ansti mentions may be much clearer on this than I am in my memory, but as I recall it, there weren't many efforts, when we started out, there weren't many efforts to stop urban highways. It was kind of there was a juggernaut that was going on. But by the time we went on, there were more efforts around the country, and it began to be understood. Certain things began to be understood that weren't understood before. For example, if you build a highway like the Interbelt would have been, to draw cars away from city streets, to make it easier to drive on city streets, you actually do the opposite, because more people use the highway than would have used it otherwise. Traffic is more congested when you build that kind of highway rather than less congested, and that was kind of interesting. There was also this assumption that somehow it had to happen, that automobiles had, I have a whole section in this book on the automobile industry and the automobile lobby and how powerful it was and how important it was. People assumed certain things about the car and the romance of the car and so on and so forth, and this was a challenge to it all. I felt, and we have other people to talk, so I'll stop here, but I felt that to me, the amazing thing was, first of all, I felt, yes, I can use my skills in public. That's part of what I want to do. Just the little coda to that is I'm just now working with a group of students and a staff member at Brandeis to finish planning a big teach-in on Occupy, the Occupy movement for Brandeis for next Tuesday. Now, I have to explain to students what a teach-in is, right? Because they don't know the term, but so this is part of our education. But I've always felt it important to engage myself in what goes on in my local community and the larger community. And the Interbelt was really my first experience of trying myself out and seeing what I could do, working with other people, and learning a great deal along the way. When it finally ended, when the highway was defeated, there was a great sense of relief and triumph. Some people, by the way, had already left the neighborhood. They were so convinced that they would have to leave, they'd already left. Part of what surprised me a little bit and disappointed me somewhat was that when we kept track of how many people from the neighborhood actually came to protest meetings, I think they were every other week for quite a while. It wasn't all that high. I mean, most people did not go to protest meetings, but those who did were quite active and quite adamant, and I think learned a great deal. Anyhow, I'll simply close my piece of this by saying it was an extraordinary experience to be part of that. I was thrilled and amazed that somebody wanted to celebrate it 40 years later or whatever it might be, and I think it's quite fitting. And I locate this in terms of, and I will come back to my plan for a teach-in on Occupy. I think our society is moving toward a kind of a larger scale exasperation than we've seen for a long time with the established order and with what's going on. I try to tell students that the 99%, 1% formulation, which is another version of really what's going on here, is the first time that social class has been on the table in American society since the 1930s, really, you know? I mean, it's really there. The civil rights movement didn't put social class in front. The women's movement didn't put social class in front. The gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement, the anti-war movements did not put social class in front. And now it's up front. And I think everything that's happened, the belt and all these other issues have kind of helped prepare the way for a larger awareness of what are these structures around us? How do they control us? How do we deal with them? And what happens? I'm not likely to do it, but I think it'd be fantastic to go back to some of the people who were there 40 years ago and see what they and their children might be making of this by now. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you again, Gordon. So we know that this work to stop the Interbelt was not just a Cambridge issue. It was an issue for Cambridge, for Somerville, and for Boston. Much of the work that Gordon was able to do with urban planning aid helped this work stretch out and give information and skills to residents that were on the ground in other parts of the city. And Hershfang is one such person who can talk about what this meant on the other side of the river in Boston. Anne is here. Anne was an instrumental part of the South End component of the protests against the Interbelt, as I'm reading here. She was later the Women's Transportation Seminar Boston president from 1985 to 87, and served on the board of the directors for Massport and the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, as well as serving as the undersecretary for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. You know that Anne worked with Fred, we know this. She was a co-founder of Walk Boston, which is an organization which is still active and vibrant, and is still a leader in the effort to improve pedestrian safety and walking conditions. Anne, welcome you.
Street. I go to the church a block away. Don't take my home. that would be greeted with a kind of a shrug of the shoulders. I thought, all right, I'll do something fancy. I'm a sociologist, all right? I'll wear a necktie and jacket, nice shirt, and I will have charts, and I will talk in a very calm manner. And I will say, according to the data which I've collected, X, whatever percent of people in this area have lived here for over 20 years. So many have lived here for over 30 years. Then I had data on how many people had relatives living within a 2-block radius, a 4-block radius, or whatever. Then I had data on how many people use local neighborhood facilities like churches, stores, and so on and so forth. So I was trying to define a neighborhood in terms of people's anchoring in it, their connections with it, the networks that they had. And although it really didn't amount to much more than don't take my home, it's my home, it was fancy, all right? It was academic, and it was calm, and I was wearing a necktie and jacket. And I thought, well, that's part of what I can do. I can use my professional skills to translate something into terms that are acceptable to people who are persuaded by that kind of thing. Erik Erikson once in a book said, he said, I'm going to use a chart now, and he says, charts are the kinds of things that are helpful for the kinds of people who are helped by that kind of thing. I felt that way about using all the charts I was using, but it seemed to work. Anyway, what happened was that, in fact, many people felt discouraged and felt hopeless. People did not want to move. I remember I addressed a meeting of highway planners at some point in the late stages of the Belt movement, and one of the highway planners said to me, he says, you know, I don't get it. What's the matter with people moving? People move their neighborhoods all the time. I moved 3 years ago. My family and I moved from, I forget, Delaware to Washington. What's the big deal about moving? I said, look, if you moved from Delaware to Washington, it was probably an upward mobile move, wasn't it? He said, mm-hmm. I said, it probably had to do with your career and something that was important to you. I said, well, when you tell somebody you have to leave your house because a highway is going to come through, that's not the same thing. You get it? That's not the same thing. It really, really isn't the same thing. And he didn't get it, but I tried. Anyway, it was an amazing experience, and part of what was so thrilling was, and no one could foresee this at the beginning, that as I remember it, and the documentary that Ansti mentions may be much clearer on this than I am in my memory, but as I recall it, there weren't many efforts, when we started out, there weren't many efforts to stop urban highways. It was kind of there was a juggernaut that was going on. But by the time we went on and on, there were more efforts around the country. And it began to be understood. Certain things began to be understood that weren't understood before. For example, if you build a highway like the Inner Belt would have been, to draw cars away from city streets, to make it easier to drive on city streets, you actually do the opposite, because more people use the highway than would have used it otherwise. Traffic is more congested when you build that kind of highway rather than less congested, and that was kind of interesting. There was also this assumption that somehow it had to happen, that automobiles had, I have a whole section in this book on the automobile industry and the automobile lobby and how powerful it was and how important it was. People assumed certain things about the car and the romance of the car and so on and so forth, and this was a challenge to it all. I felt, and we have other people to talk, so I'll stop here, but I felt that to me, the amazing thing was, first of all, I felt, yes, I can use my skills in public. That's part of what I want to do. Just the little coda to that is I'm just now working with a group of students and a staff member at Brandeis to finish planning a big teach-in on Occupy, the Occupy movement for Brandeis for next Tuesday. Now, I have to explain to students what a teach-in is, right? Because they don't know the term, but so this is part of our education. But I've always felt it important to engage myself in what goes on in my local community and the larger community. And the Inner Belt was really my first experience of trying myself out and seeing what I could do, working with other people, and learning a great deal along the way. When it finally ended, when the highway was defeated, there was a great sense of relief and triumph. Some people, by the way, had already left the neighborhood. They were so convinced that they would have to leave, they'd already left. Part of what surprised me a little bit and disappointed me somewhat was that when we kept track of how many people from the neighborhood actually came to protest meetings, I think they were every other week for quite a while. It wasn't all that high. I mean, most people did not go to protest meetings, but those who did were quite active and quite adamant, and I think learned a great deal. Anyhow, I'll simply close my piece of this by saying it was an extraordinary experience to be part of that. I was thrilled and amazed that somebody wanted to celebrate it 40 years later, or whatever it might be, and I think it's quite fitting, and I locate this in terms of, and I will come back to my plan for a teach-in on Occupy. I think our society is moving toward a kind of a larger scale exasperation than we've seen for a long time with the established order and with what's going on. I try to tell students that the 99% 1% formulation, which is another version of really what's going on here, it's the first time that social class has been on the table in American society since the 1930s, really, you know? I mean, it's really there. The civil rights movement didn't put social class in front. The women's movement didn't put social class in front. The gay, lesbian, bi, trans movement, the anti-war movements did not put social class in front. And now it's up front. And I think everything that's happened, the belt and all these other issues have kind of helped prepare the way for a larger awareness of what are these structures around us? How do they control us? How do we deal with them? And what happens? I'm not likely to do it, but I think it'd be fantastic to go back to some of the people who were there 40 years ago and see what they and their children might be making of this by now. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you again, Gordon. So we know that this work to stop the inner belt was not just a Cambridge issue. It was an issue for Cambridge, for Somerville, and for Boston. Much of the work that Gordon was able to do with urban planning aid helped this work stretch out and give information and skills to residents that were on the ground in other parts of the city. And Hershfang is one such person who can talk about what this meant on the other side of the river in Boston. Anne is here. Anne was an instrumental part of the South End component of the protests against the inner belt, as I'm reading here. She was later the Women's Transportation Seminar Boston president from 1985 to 87, and served on the board of the directors for Massport and the Massachusetts Turnpike Authority, as well as serving as the undersecretary for the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. You know that Anne worked with Fred, we know this. She was a co-founder of Walk Boston, which is an organization which is still active and vibrant, and is still a leader in the effort to improve pedestrian safety and walking conditions. Anne, welcome you.
This is a wonderful series, and I want to thank the Cambridge Historical Society for doing it. It's a great pleasure to me to be able to look back at those years, and it's also fascinating to hear the Cambridge point of view, because I, of course, am all wrapped up in the Boston point of view. So thank you for reaching across the river and including us. As I have thought about Cambridge and listened to Ansti in particular, my sense of your activity in Cambridge is that the resistance started earlier than in Boston. You had really smart people. You had the opportunity for a lot of technical savvy. You had a lot of political strength, and I presume that your path for the inner belt was probably less minority and less poor than the Boston path for the highways. Your start created the broader coalition, and we're very grateful in the information that we had. In Boston, the inner belt, let me just see. In Boston, the inner belt came across the Charles at the BU Bridge, went across the Fenway, and apparently after some pressure was going to be put underground on Park Drive and through the Fenway. Went by the Museum of Fine Arts, right next to it, by Northeastern. And I've been curious, probably somebody in the audience knows whether they ever uttered a peep about this highway that was going to wipe right by them. I don't remember. And came across Huntington Avenue and erupted at what is now Ruggles Station into a 5-level high series of ramps that would have handled 160,000 cars a day coming from the inner belt, from which was going to continue on to the Southeast Expressway. So the traffic came from the inner belt from an extension of I-95, which had stopped at Route 128. It was going to be extended through Jamaica Plain into this intersection. From this series of ramps, the traffic would then, a lot of it, go into Boston. 50,000 cars a day were estimated to be going into Boston. 40,000 along a South End bypass at the end of the South End and a half block from my house, and 10,000 down Tremont Street in the South End, which was going to be widened by 2 lanes. So this 160,000 cars a day interchange was right in the middle of several public housing projects, and it was elevated, obviously. The Cambridge Innerbelt total of lanes threatened was 8. In Boston, we had 8 from the Innerbelt, 8 from the I-95 extension, 4 road lanes on the South End bypass, 3 Orange Line tracks, and 2 lanes on Tremont Street. So we were going to have a total of 25 new lanes of traffic. The approach of the State Department of Public Works in Boston, let me just see how I'm doing on the Department of Public Works approach in Boston was to just take properties. Their approach, and this is what I heard. I'm not saying that I can vouch for it, but what we were hearing was that they wanted to take as many houses as they could, as soon as they could, because they calculated that if the land were bare, people would be more likely to accept a road. They also, we are told, maybe by urban planning aid, wanted to build the interchange, this massive interchange, first, again, to the interchange. And they were planning to take 2,200 households plus a lot of industries in Lower Roxbury. The BRA, the Boston Redevelopment Authority, added itself to the threat by creating the South End and Lower Roxbury Urban Renewal Plan, which was the largest in the country at the time, passed by the City Council in 1966. That was supposed to take 3,550 households. So this is a total of almost 7,000 being taken by the highway and urban renewal. Each of these BRA plan houses was shown on a map, so the owners knew that they were targeted. The BRA also believed in getting the houses as soon as possible, taking them as soon as possible. And in fact, one of the early pushes of the broader anti-highway movement was to stop houses being taken, particularly by the highway, before it was sure that the highway was going to be built and what the route was going to be. Basically, the Department of Public Works was just snatching them up, and one of the early pushes of the movement was to stop that until it was clear what was going to happen. And eventually, after a year or two of effort, they succeeded. The inner belt in Boston had the harshest impact on Lower Roxbury, which was low income, mostly black, and mixed residential and industrial area. It had some very nice parts. There was a park called Madison Park, which was a park surrounded by brick houses. And I remember in one of our meetings some very genteel black elderly ladies came to express their hope that this wouldn't happen to them. And we went over and looked at Madison Park, and it was indeed a very lovely place. They could not, however, sell their houses. One, there was very little interest in them. Two, they couldn't get bank mortgages or anything because, one, they were black, and two, they were low income, and three, they were threatened by the highway and by urban renewal. So they were kind of stuck there. They and we in the South End had no political support, which Cambridge had a lot of. We had, until urban planning aid really came, and until some of us, whom I think of now but didn't think of then as the new gentry, moved in, the sort of young professionals who were willing to risk coming into a new neighborhood and who had some skills. I will spare you, out of decency and politeness at the moment, my opinions of the Boston Redevelopment Authority in all of this. I can tell you that they were the most hated, here's a cleared area. that they were hated in the South End. And when they left, I said to somebody, well, what are we going to do now that the enemy that holds us together has left? We're going to fight each other, which has been somewhat true. So, as for how I came into this, my husband and I bought a house in the South End on West Rutland Square between Columbus and the railroad tracks, 5 railroad tracks of the Penn Central Main Line. In 1965, we bought it at public auction on the front steps without having seen the inside, because they wouldn't let us, the BRA wouldn't let us see the inside. When we saw the inside, we could see why they wouldn't let us see it, because it was just horrible. It had no plumbing, no electricity. It was just awful. But we set about it and spent a couple of years doing a whole lot of personal hand labor, fixing it up. We were the only whites on our block, which was a new situation for us. The area that I'm going to be talking about is the South End bypass area is basically a block from Columbus to the tracks and from the tracks to St. Botolph and 8 blocks long from Mass Avenue to Dartmouth Street. That whole area was primarily black, low income, unempowered, had no, as your descriptions, had no expectation of having anybody ever do anything for them, having the police come when they called them, having the city do anything. I remember when we first moved in, we were broken into, and I called up the police and said I was scared. There were 4 floors upstairs, and maybe they were still there. And the police said, "Lady, go out and stand on the sidewalk." I mean, they really had no power at all, political, any kind. The South End bypass was planned, as I said, to be 4 roadway lanes, 3 Orange Line. The Orange Line was being moved over from Washington Street, 3 Orange Line tracks. The Penn Central Main Line, DC, Boston train was, and there's a slight disagreement in my expert counselors earlier this evening, was either going to be stopped at 128 and everybody was expected to get off of it and get on the Orange Line, which was going to be extended, to get off the main, the main train and get on the Orange Line and come into Back Bay and South Station, into Back Bay actually. Or it was going to be routed around the Dorchester line and come into South Station that way. In any case, it was going to stop going into Back Bay. And the thing that's fascinating to me is, as I sort of looked through the websites and everything of the history to get myself in order for this, nobody mentions what was going to happen to the railroad. And in some ways, it was the most astonishing thing to think of eliminating it. 44 houses were to be taken on the South End side of the tracks, along the tracks for the expansion. I didn't know anything about this. We'd been there 3 years, I guess, from 66 to 69, and it just hadn't crossed my horizon. It was at the edge of the South End Urban Renewal Plan map, and just didn't think of it until we heard, Ken Kruckemeyer and I, heard that there was going to be a meeting at the Harriet Tubman House and Urban Planning Aid was coming to present information about what was happening. We went, and it was the most astonishing presentation I've almost ever seen in my life, and I assume you did that all around the region, and that's what helped enliven people. But they showed the interchange, the state Department of Public Works drawing of the interchange. They showed all the figures. They showed the houses that were going to be taken. They showed the whole impact of the highways in Boston. And I don't remember them organizing in any way. They just showed what was going to happen. The head of Tubman House asked if there were any volunteers to consider this further. 4 of us put up our hands. Ken Kruckemeyer and I were the new people in town, and there were 2 men, David Scott and Barry Adams, who'd lived in the neighborhood, people of color who'd lived in the neighborhood longer. We established something called the Tubman Area Planning Council. And we sat down to talk about what we were going to do. We didn't have any idea what we were going to do. We'd never advocated, we'd never organized. It's the first we'd heard of it. So we talked a lot to figure out what to do, where to do it, who to do it, how to do it. We decided that we would work with the coalition which was developing at the time of Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, and the South End to oppose the bypass and the Southwest Corridor. And we would also, the I-95 extension, and we would also work with the broader Greater Boston Committee on the Transportation Crisis, GBC coalition, to oppose all of the highways, but that we would focus our main energies on the South End bypass. So we learned the hard way. We worked like dogs. We organized and organized and organized. We made up, handed out flyers with facts. We got petitions. I was going to bring some of the petitions, but I decided waiving them was too complicated. We had meetings. We did publicity. This is actually where the bypass was going to go. That's where the train was, and on the right is the South End, I think. But anyway, we worked like dogs. And we had meetings on every street to talk to the neighbors. We organized the neighbors to be active. The neighbors, as Gordon has said, felt hopeless. They'd been threatened by urban renewal, for one thing. The BRA had come around and said, we're going to take your house, we're not going to take your house, we're going to take your house. And then here was this highway taking, and so they just felt kind of hopeless. But we inspirited them and organized them and took them to larger meetings, took them down to the Gardner Auditorium. We wrote a gazillion letters to Mayor White and Barney Frank and Governor Sargent and everybody else who might be useful. We had no political strength at all either. We had 3 state representatives, and they all lived in Jamaica Plain, and didn't care at all about us, so we had no political strength. So our pleas to Mayor White and Barney Frank received sympathy, but that was all. We asked them to stop the bypass, to say that the bypass would not be built, should not be built. And then I learned, and we learned, a huge lesson. My husband, Herb, managed a campaign for Tom Atkins, who ran for city councilor at the time. He actually managed all 3 of Tom's campaigns, but Tom won, and he was black. He was the first black citywide councilor ever. And so we had somebody in the council. We had an ear in the council. Then Herb ran successfully a slate which took over the Ward 4 Democratic Committee. And then Mayor White decided to run for governor against Frank Sargent. And the Ward 4 Democratic Committee had 3 votes at the convention to choose the candidate. So the 3 delegates, which included my husband and Mel King and Martin Gopin, went to Mayor White and asked him to commit to affordable housing and to stop and to oppose the bypass. Suddenly, spit spot, yes, he opposed the bypass. And let me just see. Oh, here's just one of our public meeting flyers. And here's an article in the Globe by Alan Lupo about a meeting we had with Barney Frank. And so the mayor decided he would oppose the bypass, and he wrote a letter, which is this letter, and I'm just going to read the beginning. It's from Herb. It's from Barney Frank, actually, executive assistant to the mayor. Dear Herb, this is the follow-up letter which I promised as a confirmation of our conversations on the South End bypass. To start, I want to reiterate that Kevin White's position is that the road should not be built, etc., with some details. You'll notice it's October 27th, 1970, right about the critical time when the vote was coming up, I'm sure. I mean, I don't have letters to him or any, get it in print, but I'm sure that happened and generated that letter. Whoops, going the wrong way. So we won, basically, our local fight, but we continued to work and to demonstrate and to write letters. with GBC. I worked with the League of Women Voters. The Boston League of Women Voters did a study and came out with a position against the highways, which was extremely important in this because they were the respectable fringe of the anti-highway movement. So when we stood up, you know, we weren't those radicals who were marching around with things. We were the wives of the Chamber of Commerce, so to speak. And in fact, we got coverage in the Globe that subtly said that sort of thing. And GBC, I don't know if anybody is going to talk about that coalition, but it was the most amazing coalition of people who never would have gotten along together, East Boston, South Boston, suburbs, I mean, Roxbury. And it was headed by Chuck Turner, who was from Roxbury and who, as you know, was a sort of a militant-looking black fellow who was very good, very stern. We had one meeting that was going to be with Al Kramer, and he gathered us all together, the GBC coalition, and we sat around the table, and somebody came out and said that Al couldn't meet with us, but this person would like to meet with us. And Chuck said, "Oh dear, that's too bad. If we can't meet with Al, we'll leave and come back another time." And it really blew me away because the effort it had taken him to get all these disparate people together was immense. The result was that Al Kramer came and talked to us. So we all continued to work with the broader coalition. And when Governor Sargent was set to give his speech in November 1972, as far as I know, we all sat in our own houses. I mean, we sort of didn't dare be together, you know, and we didn't have any idea what he was going to say, which is amazing now to me. So we sat there hanging on every word. And when he got through, you know, we were all on the ceiling. And we all rushed over to the GBC offices, which were on Mount Auburn, on JFK Street, Boylston Street in Cambridge, and had a wild party, except for 2 or 3 hardcore people, Chuck being one of them, who were off in a side room writing the governor a letter, complaining that he hadn't stopped the Somerville piece. Anyway, but the big excitement at the Tubman Area Planning Council group was that one of the things that the governor said is it didn't make any sense to build a highway because Mayor White was not going to let it build the South End bypass. And we felt so pleased that we had focused on that. Just as a sort of an aftermath, but by the way, there were a lot of heroes in this, and urban planning aid was just from my point of view, was just a major hero, providing all of this information. And I hope somebody next time talks a little about Frank Sargent. It's just an amazing decision for him, and about Al Kramer, and about Alan Altshuler. In each of their different ways, they were quite remarkable politicians, political people. After this, in the South End, even before the victory was done, the Tubman Area Planning Council expanded across the South End into the South End Committee on Transportation, drew up a traffic and transit plan, published it in 1972, took it all around the South End. Its point was to stop cross traffic, commuter traffic going through the South End. That was its goal. We convinced the city to adopt it, and they endorsed it in 1974. And all of this was built in the early 1980s. And I put out there on the table a description of what the plan was and what it did achieve. And I commend it to your attention. It's made the South End what it is. Because if we had what was planned for us, it would never have been such a pleasant area, and nobody would have wanted to move in there. And sometimes we give walks. Ken Kruckemeyer, who's sitting here in the second row, was hired to then we turned our attention to what to do with this South End bypass I-95 corridor. Ken was hired to manage the Southwest Corridor design and its public process, and we worked again with our colleagues in Roxbury and Jamaica Plain on that. And I continued as an outside agitator. And Ken, as you can see, did a splendid, splendid job. And so instead of noisy, stinking highway, we have 4.7 miles of beautiful park. This is what some of the knitters in the South End are doing on the bike racks. And I guess that wasn't the beautiful park picture that I wanted, but in any case, it's a beautiful park, as you know. And finally, I just want to show you something that I would like you to go and see. At Roxbury Crossing Station, there's an 8-foot by 4-foot enamel plaque right outside the station, so every students will see it, telling the history of the Southwest Corridor movement, the history showing that horrible interchange that urban planning aid brought to our attention, telling the history, the chronology, and across the top are the names of everybody who worked in the Southwest in the Southwest Corridor Project and the anti-highway movement. Putting the names on was Fred Salvucci's suggestion when we showed the plaque to him for his ideas. So do go see it. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to be part of and to talk about.
Thank you, Ann. And I particularly enjoyed your comment about the next series. So it seems like, Gavin, you may have some additional work to do because we want more and more. There are so many stories we could possibly tell, as you can imagine, it just goes, and hopefully it will. I want to be sure to recognize Mayor Henrietta Davis is in the audience somewhere. Hello, Mayor Davis. Want to say hello? And also Mayor Ackerman had to slip out, but she says thank you, and she looks forward to seeing you guys around. So lots of love in the audience. We have our final speaker is here, last but not least, for sure. Ms. Barbara Norfleet has really taken charge of being able to collect some of the visual culture and material around the Inner Belt fight. Barbara is going to share some of her work with us. Barbara is a senior. Yes. Okay, all right, sorry. Barbara was a senior lecturer in the Visual Environmental Studies Department at Harvard from 1981 until she retired in 1986. She remained a curator of photography until 2001 and is still an advisor to the department, yeah? So she received her BA from Swarthmore College and her MA and PhD in social relations from Harvard University and Radcliffe College. Her works have been widely shown in the United States and Europe. She has written over 15 publications. One of her first was Six Speak. So I know that many folks here are familiar with this work, and so really excited to have you here. A book of photographs and words that showed families and their homes that would have been destroyed by the construction of the Inner Belt. Bobby has also been working on a book called Faith, Hope, and Charity, which is forthcoming about social reform at the turn of the century. So, Bobby, so delighted to have you be able to share your work. Great. I apologize if I misspoke. It's so good. Okay, you're here.
Well, all I can say is how much fun it has been for me to revisit this because it happened so many years ago. And unlike Ansti, I did not live in the neighborhood. I lived far away in Cambridge. And I probably would not have gotten involved in the Inner Belt at all, except I became a member of the League of Women Voters in Cambridge. And I became head of city affairs. Now, when I became head of city affairs for the League, they had gotten consensus backing the Inner Belt. They thought it should be built. And I found out that the Cambridge Civic Association, the Planning Board, and the planners, MIT, Harvard, the City Council, everybody thought the Inner Belt should be built. Nobody was against it except the people whose homes were being taken, whom Ansti had organized. And they were very vocal. They were certainly against it, but nobody else was. And so I began to question, why weren't everyone for this? I had, as a graduate student, I had lived in Central Square, and I had also lived in a cold water flat at the West End. And the West End was, from 1953, it was being threatened by urban renewal, which unfortunately happened at the end of the 50s, and it was razed. What a terrible mistake. But I knew from having lived in these two places that they were real communities, they were safe, they were wonderful to live in. I missed both all my life. I enjoyed every moment I spent. So I decided that what I would do would be I would go down to Brookline Elm, and I would walk around, and I would meet people, and I would talk to people, and see whether this road should be built. Well, I talked to many of the leaders of the churches, and I talked to many of the people. And I came to the conclusion that it wasn't up to me to organize anybody, because somebody had done such a magnificent job of that. It was up to me to do something that would persuade people, persuade all those organizations that this road should not be built. So in spite of getting credit for taking the photographs here, I took one photograph in the book, Six Feet, and that changed my life, because then I gave up being a psychologist. I realized my whole career was wrong, and I became a photographer. So this book was very important in my own life. But so to get back to the book, I decided that if I was going to persuade, I had to do case studies. I wanted to do a little booklet. It's not large. It's all 40 pages, 42, I think. And I wanted to show images and interviews with the people. And just as Gordy did interviews, I did interviews. I did it in 1966. In fact, I think I did it in 1965, but it was published in 1966. It was called Six Speak. I wanted to call it Below the Belt, but in 1966, people thought that was a little suggestive. So I never got the right name. So at any rate, here we see the belt again. Remember when you see this 8-lane high-rise highway, that Cambridge is 6¼ square miles. It is tiny. It's one of the tiniest cities you can think of. And what you have there are the names of the people that I did interview and photograph. I talked to many more. I had certain rules. One was they had to own a house, because I wanted people who were threatened to lose their house, and which meant automatically that although I talked to a lot of people who were quite poor there, it did mean that I didn't really, no really poor person is included in the study. There's one person included, and I'm not quite sure, because I knew at the time, but does anyone know how you pronounce Manitas' name? Nobody. All right, we'll call him Manitas, Peter. He would have been left behind. His house was not taken, but the people who would be left behind were just as badly off as the people who were taken. So what I'm going to do now, I also wanted people all along the line, because there's actually not one community there. There are several communities. It's a linear road, and so there are several quite different, very strong communities there. I went through the interviews. I read them for this talk, and I came across certain themes that took place. And I'm going to read you the remarks that people make. The first one was something that Gordy mentioned, and that is the immense amount of localism. That these people, because there is mixed land use, these people didn't have to get in a car. They could go to church. They could shop for food. They could shop for clothes. Their relatives and friends, they could go visit them. There was nothing that they had to do to get into a car. And so with this localism, I think comes a tremendous feeling of pride in your community and a love of your community. And what I'm going to do here is give you quotes from the people. This is a picture I love from 6 Feet. Oh, by the way, who did take the photographs? 2 students of mine at Harvard did, Glenn Percy and Dick Rogers. And I'll go into a little story about why mine was different. But this is one of the pictures they took, and I love it because it shows a store, and behind is something that looks suspiciously like a three-decker, which shows about the mixed neighborhoods. The other nice thing about mixed neighborhoods is that Mr. Suero, Antonio Suero, could have his upholstery store right behind his house. And so he could easily do his work. But this is a little store on Elm Street run by Sarah Rotnowski. And the fact that she could have her store in her house meant that she could also take care of her husband who was ill and still have a store to support her. I wonder that the people who lived there were aware of this is very interesting, and I want to read you a few quotes because the book has interviews and quotes. I do everything here by walking. I don't drive. I can shop, enjoy the... I better put on my glasses, sorry. By the way, I fell in love with this community doing this project. I really didn't know it beforehand that well. I had lived there, but I'm 86. And I have never done PowerPoint before.
It's fun, isn't it?
And I thank Gavin for all the work he did, and with dealing with me, too. All right, we'll start this over. I do everything here by walking. I don't drive. I can shop, enjoy the beauty of the river, and take my nephew to a park. I walk to church and to work. For a person like me who knows she is going to have to work until she can't work anymore, and for a person who doesn't drive, my job at the Cambridge Community Center might be my most important loss. And then John Scott says, you can walk anywhere. It is near the shops, and at the same time it is so peaceful and safe, and there is no rowdyism. Here you, your wife, your children can wander all over the neighborhood. And again, this is John Mosley, I don't drive, and we can do everything by walking. See my family, go to church, shop, see friends and family. And I want to say that as I went through these interviews, Jane Jacobs' book on the death and life of American cities influenced me very much. I don't know how many of you have read it. But she brings up the things that really saved the North End from having happened to it, what happened to the West End and in Boston. And the interesting thing to me, as I went through these interviews, and I just found this out when I went through this to give this talk, is that all the people say the same thing she said. There was this intellectual who talked about why we should save these neighborhoods. And one of the big things she talks about is mixed land use and the fact that you can do everything. And as I go through this and went through their interviews, they could have written her book for her. All she had to do was really talk to them. She didn't have to go around and look. So the next thing that is terribly important to these people is their home. And this is my one picture, and I'll tell you how I became a photographer. My student, who I first gave the job to do this, came back with beautiful art pictures. I had never taken a picture of peeling paint and old wood and so forth. And I said, no, I want Henrietta Jackson's house to look the way she sees it and the way she loves it. And so I borrowed a camera. And I went and took this one picture. So it's my one picture in the book. And I realized my whole career was wrong. And I changed fields. So at any rate. And so let us talk about the homes just a little bit. Their home is more to them than it is to most of us. And one reason is not just that they scrimped and saved to buy it, many of us did that, but that if they needed a new tile floor, if they needed a new door, if they wanted bookcases, if their house needed painting, they did it themselves. Both the women and the men. So in a sense, their home was like a member of their family. They had literally created it. Most of these homes were pretty in bad shape when they bought them. And so many people really started from scratch creating a home. And so in a way, they built their houses in a way that most of us have not. And I think they express this very, very well. This is Henrietta's house, and I will read what she says and show another picture. You know, there is a lot of personal energy and time and hard work in my 2 homes here. How we have fixed this house is not the money, but hours and days and months and years of work. I put up all this wallpaper myself. I did all the tile myself. My yard looked like a city dump. I carted all the rubbish out and carted all the dirt in. We took out 4 truckloads of junk and debris. I love my garden. Gardening is so important to me. And again, here's John Mosley, and there is his front door. And the neighborhood was beginning to deteriorate when I was there because the belt had been over their heads so much that people had stopped fixing up their houses. And they had let them, they did need painting and everything. But I was amazed that the day that my student went to take John Mosley's picture, he was up on that ladder painting his house in spite of the threat of the inner belt. And he was 73 years old. And I also want to read, this is from this quote is from Peter Manises. But how can they compensate for the work, sweat, and agony that my wife and I put into making this the kind of home we wanted? When I bought this house, it was in a wicked way, a wreck. I have spent as much on it as we paid for it. Much of this was for myself, but much was also done to keep up the neighborhood and to have pride in my community. But why talk? I'll lose. I don't even know how my daughter will go to school. He's the person who would be left behind. Now, some of these people expressed sort of despondency and depression over this. Now, Eric Lindemann was a doctor, and he did a study of the West End, and he interviewed people. And a lot of the people said, if I leave this area, I'm going to die. I'm going to become ill. And then he followed them up. And lo and behold, they did die. They did become ill. They did become depressed. And there's a wonderful article called Grieving for a Lost Home. It's one of the most beautiful sociological articles I think that's ever been written that goes into his work in this area. But this was also true at the people here. Maria Suero. This is John Scott in front of his home. I wanted to show you how proud he is of it. But Maria Suero is here in her garden, and she said, "It has made me feel depressed. For a long time, I couldn't even think of the name belt. I had such a block. I can't even think of what will happen to us. I can't think ahead. All you have to do is mention the belt, and I get a headache." And then Peter Manitas said, he's the one who's left behind. "I tend to despondency in many ways over this road, but it is much harder for my wife. My wife was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The tension had built up to the point where she said if she stayed any longer, she'd crack up. Ask her doctor. Most people just don't know what something like this means to us. That's why I had to send my wife to visit her family in Greece with my little girl." So what I was trying to do, as I said, was really use persuasion here. So what else can we say about these homes? Every single person I interviewed, including people who aren't in the book, because we only had the money to do 6 different people, rented out rooms for income. Had other tenants living, it wasn't rooms, it was apartments, but had other tenants living in their house. This is a wonderful thing for several reasons. One, it gives them a buffer against losing their job, against getting ill. They would still get an income. But besides that, it means that they can make the neighborhood stable. As someone pointed out, people have lived here for many years, the people who own their homes. And it gives housing for the poor. And good housing for the poor with a live-in landlord. Or it can give housing to aged parents, or it can give housing to children who are have grown up but haven't quite known what they're going to do with their lives. Now, the three-decker has never won any beauty contests. But at the time this was written, and unfortunately I don't think this is true anymore, particularly in West Cambridge, the three-decker was the cheapest, best housing that you could ever build. It had air, it had light, it had space. And many of these people, where they're tenants, they own three-decker houses, which are all over Cambridge. And these people, the people who are not as well off as they were, got excellent housing in three-deckers. And I don't think many people will copy the three-decker. One of the interesting things, if you go into West Cambridge, where you find some three-deckers that have had so much money spent on them that they're actually beautiful. And so maybe there's some hope for that. But at any rate, so there's one other thing about this, this area. Now, what I haven't mentioned, this is just John Scott's house where he had three tenants. What I haven't mentioned is the sense of community, and that may be the most important thing of all, which Ansti, certainly after her talk, we know this, that the sense of community was terribly, terribly important. And I'm going to read you a couple of things on this. One of the nicest things you can say about this place is the people. The whole air of the neighborhood is friendliness and interest. They have a wholesome curiosity. The man across the street brings my little nephew back when he crosses the street. A little thing, but it's what counts. Another man plants that empty lot down the street with flowers. He doesn't even own it, just so we can look at it and to keep it up. The man across the street fixed my gate. You can't give this up. It would be like starting out in school again to change communities now. And then there's Mrs. Sarah Radnowski in her store, and she said, I've had this little store and house for over 20 years. I love it. How can they compensate me for the goodwill I've got in this store? I know every customer. I'm selling to little kids now, and I knew their mothers when they were little kids, and I knew their grandmothers when they were young mothers. I'm invited to all the baby showers, the christenings. I'm Jewish, and we just had a bar mitzvah for my boy, Sheldon, and all the neighbors came. We are part of everybody's family, and they are part of ours. I'll miss all this. I'll never live in another neighborhood for long, not at my age, so I'll never get to know anyone that well again. I feel so comfortable here, like an old shoe. I may be misshapen and everything else, but comfortable. To newcomers, this street may seem like an eyesore, but we just don't see the sores. Now, one thing that all the leaders of the church mentioned to me was that this was one of the most integrated communities they knew, that it wasn't just that you had every kind of person living there, but they actually got together with one another, and they were friends. And again, this group of people really foresaw Jane Jacobs, although actually her communities didn't begin to be as integrated as this community. But one of the things that interested me was how they verbalized what this meant to them. And in various pictures, you will see that whites and blacks are mixing. The neighbors here are so nice, and quite a mixture. Those houses which look out on my yard, one belongs to a Greek, that one's Italian, that Irish, and those are colored. That's one person. This is actually in that was Henrietta Jackson's yard. This is John Scott's yard, where again, when they took the picture, there were whites and blacks on the porch playing. I want a sprinkling of everything, just like this. You find a bit of everything in Cambridge and are constantly surprised. Everybody and every kind live here. And then I think, in a way, Mrs. Soero says it best. She says, Cambridge is like a bouquet of flowers. You see all colors, all shapes, all kinds of people. I love the students too. Oh, you want me to stop? You can. All right. I won't tell you about the mannesses leaving behind, but I just want to say one thing at the end. So far, we've really talked about people losing their homes and so forth. But I just want to say one general statement that I think that the important question in all of this, underlying all of this, is how do we live on our land and how do we save it? And how having a car culture in cities cannot be sustainable. The suburbs may need cars, suburbia, and they obviously have to get into cities, but we shouldn't let them get in with their cars. We should make sure that they don't ruin our cities.